Hey guys, tonight we're about to dive into one of the most exciting and dangerous rituals of the medieval world, knights' tournaments. Picture it, a grand arena, banners fluttering in the wind, a crowd eagerly awaiting the clash of knights. The smell of leather and iron fills the air, and the clang of swords and shields echoes throughout the ground. This was no mere sport. It was a spectacle that brought together the nobility, warriors, and the masses in ways that were both thrilling and perilous. But these tournaments were more than just displays of physical prowess. Behind the glimmering armor and the thrilling jousts, there were deep-rooted rituals and traditions that shaped every aspect of the event. Tonight, we're going to uncover the secret rituals behind these medieval tournaments, the customs, codes, and symbols that turned a simple competition into an event that defined an era. But before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to see where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The birth of the medieval tournament is tied to the development of chivalry and the growing social importance of knights. These tournaments didn't start as grand spectacles. Instead, they originated as practical exercises in battle and combat. Knights, as the warrior elite of the medieval period, needed to stay sharp and hone their skills. Early tournaments were simple training events where knights would engage in mock battles, practicing their swordplay, jousting, and horsemanship in a controlled, competitive environment. This was particularly important in an era where warfare was the core function of the knightly class, and demonstrating one's skill in battle was essential to their reputation. Historians still argue whether the tournament was primarily a martial training exercise or a form of entertainment. Some believe tournaments evolved purely out of the need to practice combat skills, while others argue that they began to take on a social and celebratory role as the Middle Ages progressed. In either case, the tournament gradually transformed from a practice session for knights into a grand public event. It became an arena where knights could demonstrate not only their physical prowess, but also their adherence to the chivalric code, the ethical system that governed knights' behavior, focusing on honor, bravery, and loyalty. As the tournaments became more elaborate, they evolved into the spectacles we associate with the Middle Ages today, where knights would compete in various events, including jousting, sword fights, and melees, with a crowd of spectators watching. Over time, the medieval tournament became a reflection of the values of chivalry. It was not just a way for knights to showcase their combat skills. It was a public display of honor, loyalty, and respect for the social order. In fact, tournaments were often held in conjunction with important royal celebrations, feasts, or religious festivals. The inclusion of nobility and the court made it not just a battle for glory, but a way to reinforce one's social standing. But while tournaments may have started with military purposes, they quickly became much more than that. They turned into full-fledged events, often staged with elaborate rituals. The knights had to prepare not only physically, but also mentally. Before the tournament even began, knights would undergo a series of rituals and oaths designed to reaffirm their commitment to the chivalric code and their role as honorable combatants. These rituals were deeply embedded in the medieval worldview, reinforcing the idea that combat and competition were not just about winning, they were about upholding a higher morale and ethical standard. The tournaments themselves became events where knights displayed their courage, skill, and honor in the eyes of both their peers and the public. And yet, while tournaments were intended to be noble affairs, they could also be dangerous, something we'll explore in more detail later. In the beginning, these events were more about practice than spectacle, but over time, they became larger and more intricate, evolving into the highly organized and heavily ritualized contests that we think of today. Let's now step behind the scenes and look at the secret rituals that knights underwent before they even mounted their horses for a tournament. The preparations for these events were deeply rooted in the chivalric code, a complex set of rules that governed not only the knight's behavior, but also their moral and spiritual duties. These rituals were more than just physical preparations. They were about ensuring that a knight's honor was intact, that they entered the tournament with a clear conscience, and that they were spiritually and mentally prepared for the battle ahead. Imagine the atmosphere of a medieval camp or castle before the tournament begins. The air is thick with anticipation, but also with the quiet reverence of ritual. The knight's armor is carefully checked and polished, his horse groomed and saddled. But there's more to it than just physical readiness. Knights would often begin the day of the tournament with prayer or a visit to the local chapel. Religion and spirituality played a massive role in the life of a knight, and tournaments were no exception. Knights believed that to fight honorably, they needed to be in the right frame of mind. And for many, this involved seeking divine favor. Some knights would attend a special mass, asking for blessings and protection before the tournament began. It was believed that by doing so, they could ensure that their actions were in alignment with divine will. Historians still argue whether these religious rituals were genuine acts of faith or simply part of the social performance of knightly conduct. Some suggest that many knights did indeed believe in the spiritual significance of these rituals, while others believe that the piety of the knight was often more about demonstrating to society that they were morally upright. Either way, it was common for knights to publicly show their devotion, and these religious ceremonies were a key part of tournament rituals. Once the religious component was taken care of, knights would typically swear an oath before entering the tournament. This oath wasn't just about pledging to follow the rules of the event. It was an affirmation of the knight's adherence to the ideals of chivalry. By taking the oath, knights promised to fight fairly, to show courage and honor, and to respect their opponents. This oath was a deeply symbolic gesture. It was a reminder that a knight's actions, both in and out of the tournament, were supposed to be guided by a higher moral standard. The ritual preparation also extended to the knight's equipment and attire. While today we think of medieval armor as a uniform, protective gear, in the 19th century, it was still a deeply symbolic part of the knight's identity. The armor had to be carefully checked, polished, and fitted to ensure that it didn't just serve a practical purpose, but also represented the knight's status and honors. The armor was often decorated with family crests, colors, and symbols marking the knight's heritage and allegiance. This was more than just a protective suit. It was a visual representation of the knight's social standing and identity, and it needed to be in perfect condition for the tournament. Even the horses were treated with reverence. Knights were known to have a special bond with their steeds, often viewing them as partners in combat. Before a tournament, the horse would be thoroughly groomed, fed, and even blessed in some cases. Some knights would take their horses to religious sites for blessings, ensuring that their trusty steed would be as protected as they were. This connection between knight and horse was vital, particularly in jousting events where the horse's speed, agility, and the training could determine the outcome of the contest. While the ritual preparation was intense, it wasn't just about ceremony. It was about setting the right mental and emotional tone for the tournament. Knights needed to be physically prepared for the demands of combat, but they also had to be psychologically prepared for the event. The tournament was often seen as a test of not just skill, but of character. To be victorious was to demonstrate not just prowess in battle, but also personal integrity, bravery, and respect for the rules of chivalry. Knights who were unable to uphold these principles could suffer a loss of honor, which was a far worse fate than defeat in the joust. But these rituals were not without their darker undertones. While knights were expected to show respect for their opponents, the tournament was also an arena for displaying power, dominance, and prestige. A knight's performance could elevate their status in the eyes of their peers and potential patrons, and as a result, tournaments often became venues for rivalries and feuds. Competitors would sometimes engage in tournaments that were less about friendly competition and more about proving their superiority. The pageantry of the event armor, horses, and oaths masked the underlying tensions and personal rivalries that simmered just beneath the surface. The tournament itself was, therefore, not just about skill in combat. It was about displaying one's honor, integrity, and social position. Winning the tournament was a way for a knight to gain favor, reputation, and potentially lucrative rewards. These rituals, while designed to encourage fair play and respect, also reinforced the competitive nature of the knights. Even in a game that was supposed to demonstrate honor, the desire to win could lead to tensions and, at times, outright aggression. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these rituals in achieving the intended outcomes of the tournaments. Some argue that the rituals help to create a sense of order and structure in the chaotic, often brutal world of medieval warfare. Others contend that the tournaments became more about performance and spectacle, rather than genuine expressions of chivalric ideals. Regardless of where you stand on this debate, one thing is clear: The rituals that surrounded medieval tournaments played a crucial role in shaping the cultural and social significance of these events. They were not just about fighting, they were about presenting the knights as paragons of virtue, skill, and honor, whether they always lived up to that ideal or not. As we continue, let's explore the fascinating role that heralds played in the rituals surrounding medieval knights tournaments. Heralds were not just bystanders or announcers, they were integral to the smooth operation and symbolic weight of the events. Imagine yourself in the bustling scene of a medieval tournament. Knights are preparing, spectators are gathering, and somewhere nearby, a herald is preparing for his crucial role. With their distinct livery and often elaborate coats of arms, heralds were the public faces of these events, ensuring that everything ran according to plan and, perhaps more importantly, that each night's performance was properly recorded for posterity. The role of the herald was more than just administrative. It was highly ritualistic and ceremonial. These men, and sometimes women, were tasked with announcing the competitors, their heraldic titles, and the events themselves. Their responsibilities included establishing order, ensuring that the knights adhere to the rules, and providing a running commentary throughout the competition. The herald would also ensure that the noble audience knew who was competing and which families were represented in the tournament. They had to maintain a sense of decorum and spectacle throughout the day, contributing to the grandiosity of the event. A herald's work began long before the first lance was ever lifted. Heralds would travel in advance to announce the event to the surrounding regions, often carrying banners or proclamations to invite knights and spectators to attend. This act itself was part of the social ritual. The announcement was as much about building excitement and anticipation as it was about informing the public. The herald's proclamation was a symbol of the authority behind the event, and their voice carried a certain level of prestige. When the tournament finally began, it was the herald's job to make the event feel larger than life, marking the occasion with a sense of formality and grandeur. Historians still debate whether the herald's influence on the tournament was truly as powerful as it seemed, or if it was simply a performance, a well-practiced display of authority that only held weight because people believed in it. What is clear is that the herald was an essential part of the social and cultural fabric of these events, helping to organize them and add a layer of ritualistic significance to the tournament. In fact, heralds were often seen as guardians of the tournament's code and etiquette, ensuring that knights respected the rules of combat and followed the proper rituals during their contests. But the herald's role wasn't just about the announcement of names and titles. It also involved the creation of the structure within the tournament itself. Heralds helped organize the competitors, determining the schedule and matchups. They also acted as mediators when disputes arose, ensuring that the knights adhere to the honor code and handle the conflicts with respect. This was important because medieval tournaments, while often staged for entertainment and social reasons, were still taken very seriously by the knights and their families. Honor was at stake, and a knight's performance could have long-lasting consequences for his reputation. The heralds were the referees of sorts, but with a ceremonial gravitas that added a layer of drama to the event. It's also important to note the herald's connection to the wider tradition of chivalry and knighthood. Heralds were often trained in the noble traditions of heraldry, learning the intricate rules of armory, family crests, and knightly titles. They were experts in genealogy and could trace the bloodlines of the knights who competed. In a sense, they were the keepers of medieval history, preserving the legacies of noble families and ensuring that their genealogical history was respected and honored during the tournament. The herald's deep understanding of lineage added an element of respect and importance to the proceedings. This wasn't just a game or a sport. It was a ritual rooted in centuries of tradition and heritage. The rituals surrounding the herald were not limited to the tournament itself. Heralds were also responsible for overseeing the jousts and melee battles, ensuring that knights adhered to the rules and that the competition remained fair. Their influence extended to the presentation of prizes and honors after the tournament, and they were often tasked with announcing the victors and assigning titles to the champions. In many ways, the herald's actions were as important as the knights' combat, as they were the ones who ensured that the event adhered to the rules of knighthood and chivalry. Without the herald, the tournament would have lacked the sense of structure and ceremony that made it so significant. While heralds were essential to the smooth operation of tournaments, their roles were not without controversy. Some historians argue that heralds, while performing an essential function, were sometimes used to further the political and social agendas of the nobility. The herald's ability to announce who was competing and who was victorious could have far-reaching consequences, influencing the reputations of knights and their families. A knight's success or failure in a tournament could bolster or ruin his standing in the eyes of the public, and heralds, with their authority, could potentially sway the outcome of public perception by the way they presented the event. This, of course, wasn't always a conscious manipulation. It was simply part of the complex social and political dynamics of medieval life. At the end of the day, the herald's role was not just to organize and announce. It was to imbue the tournament with a sense of grandeur and tradition that transcended the physical competition. Heralds brought to life the ideals of chivalry, honor, and the knightly code, ensuring that these values were reflected in every aspect of the event. Their presence helped transform the tournament from a simple contest into an event of significant social and cultural importance. And, in many ways, the herald's influence on the tournament mirrors the larger role that ritual and ceremony played in medieval life. Everything from the combat to the social interactions was governed by codes of honor, and the heralds were the keepers of these codes. Now that we've explored the crucial role of the heralds, let's delve into one of the most iconic aspects of medieval knights' tournaments, the knights themselves, and the elaborate oaths and allegiances they swore before competing. When a knight entered a tournament, it wasn't just about showing off their strength or skill. It was about demonstrating their honor, loyalty, and adherence to the highest ideals of chivalry. Before any knight even mounted their horse or picked up their lance, they had to undergo a series of rituals and pledges that would bind them to the ethical codes of their order. Picture it, the knight, fully clad in armor, standing before an audience that includes not only fellow knights, but also lords, ladies, and the general public. Before they can participate in the tournament, they must swear an oath that holds their actions to the strictest standards of conduct. This oath was a symbol of their commitment to chivalric ideals, bravery, honor, respect for women, loyalty to their liege lord, and, above all, fairness in combat. The pledge was not taken lightly. It was a solemn promise, and breaking it was considered a great dishonor, one that could tarnish a knight's reputation for life. The chivalric oath was a defining element of medieval society. The knight's word was considered sacred, and their honor was tied to how well they upheld these values in the tournament arena. Imagine the pressure. A knight could not simply go into a tournament seeking victory for the sake of personal glory. Instead, they were expected to uphold the values of the chivalric code throughout the competition. This was especially important during jousting, where knights would compete in single combat, their lances aimed at their opponent's chest, trying to unseat them while still following strict rules of engagement. The knights' oaths were not just ceremonial or symbolic, they were deeply intertwined with their social and political identities. A knight's status in society was directly tied to their ability to honor these commitments. In fact, tournaments often served as opportunities for knights to demonstrate their loyalty to their lord, king, or cause. It was common for knights to participate in tournaments under the banner of a noble house, fighting to bring glory to their family or their lord. These allegiances were serious matters and could sometimes have far-reaching consequences in the political world. A knight's success or failure in a tournament could help determine their standing in the court and, in some cases, the favor of their sovereign. However, this allegiance to a noble house wasn't just about politics. It was about showing the world that the knight was a man of integrity, whose loyalty was unshakable. Some knights went as far as to engrave their oaths on their swords, shields, or armor, a visual reminder of their commitment to the ideals they had sworn to uphold. The idea was that every blow struck in the tournament should be a reflection of their honor, nothing less. In many ways, tournaments were a chance for knights to prove to the world that they were worthy of the title they held. Their participation wasn't merely about winning a prize, but about proving their worth as men of valor. Historians still debate the extent to which knights adhered to these oaths during tournaments. Some argue that, despite the high ideals of chivalry, knights often broke their vows in the heat of battle, prioritizing personal glory or the demands of political alliances over the chivalric code. Others suggest that the very structure of tournaments, with its strict rules and codes of conduct, meant that knights were held to a higher moral standard than they might have been in actual combat. What is clear is that these oaths were a vital part of the medieval tournament experience, shaping not only the individual knight's actions, but also the broader social context in which these events took place. In addition to the personal oaths knights took, there were often larger political and social allegiances at play. Knights who fought in tournaments were frequently involved in political maneuvering, especially when it came to choosing which side they would support in a competition. Tournaments were not just contests of physical prowess, they were often used to settle political scores, display power, and demonstrate loyalty. By fighting on behalf of a noble house or lord, knights were not only showing their martial skill, they were affirming their loyalty and their place within the larger political landscape of medieval Europe. This intersection of personal honor and political loyalty made tournaments incredibly significant in the lives of knights. Their participation in these events was a way to establish themselves in the eyes of their peers, their lord, and society at large. Victory in a tournament was not only a testament to a knight's skill, but also to their character and loyalty. The oaths they swore before entering these contests were not merely ceremonial, they were a commitment to uphold the ideals of chivalry, whether they were fighting for personal glory or for the glory of their lord. At the same time, the pressure to uphold these values and perform in the tournament arena created intense competition among knights. While the code of chivalry demanded fairness and respect for opponents, tournaments were also fiercely competitive, with knights vying for prestige, honor, and reward. It wasn't uncommon for rivalries to emerge, both on and off the battlefield, as knights sought to assert their dominance. These rivalries sometimes led to personal feuds, and in some cases, the outcomes of tournaments were manipulated for political gain, undermining the spirit of fair competition. Despite these tensions, the chivalric oaths remained central to the tournament experience. The ideal of honor, loyalty, and bravery was what defined the knightly class, and the tournament arena was the ultimate proving ground for these qualities. When a knight competed in a tournament, they weren't just participating in a sporting event, they were performing a sacred duty, a ritual that tied them to centuries of tradition and moral code. In today's world, we often think of knights as figures of history, distant and romanticized. But in the medieval period, they were living symbols of the ideals that society held dear. Their participation in tournaments was not just about the thrill of victory, it was about proving their worth as men of honor, able to live up to the highest standards of chivalry. And while the codes and rituals surrounding knights may have faded into the past, the legacy of those medieval tournaments continues to shape how we think about competition, honor, and loyalty in the modern world. Now that we've explored the oaths and allegiances knights swore before stepping into the arena, let's turn our attention to the spectacle itself, the joust. Jousting was the crown jewel of medieval tournaments, the event that most people came to see, and the one that tested the very limits of a knight's skill and courage. The knight, mounted on his steed, charging at full speed toward his opponent, lances held high, aiming to unseat the other knight with a single blow. This was the image that came to define tournaments in the public imagination. But while the joust was undeniably exciting, it was also deeply ritualistic and symbolic. The structure of the joust, the way it was conducted, and the roles that knights played in the event were all carefully designed to reflect the values of chivalry. At its heart, jousting was about more than just brute force. It was about displaying the virtues of a knight honor, courage, and skill before the watching crowd. Every joust had a deeper purpose than just a competition. It was a public statement about the knight's worth and adherence to the chivalric code. The joust typically began with the knights lining up on opposite sides of the list, the arena where the competition would take place. The list was often marked by a fence or rope, which acted as a boundary for the knights to charge within. The two knights would then be called to attention by the herald, who would announce their names, titles, and any significant accomplishments. The tension in the air would build as the knights prepared to face off in a contest of skill, precision, and strength. Historians still argue whether jousting was primarily a form of entertainment for the spectators, or if it was seen as a serious combat exercise. Some suggest that jousting was a crucial aspect of a knight's military training, helping them practice the art of mounted combat that would later serve them on the battlefield. Others believe that, while the joust had practical elements, it had evolved into more of a public spectacle, with knights competing for honor and glory rather than for military preparedness. But regardless of its origins, by the time jousting had fully developed into its own event, it had become deeply embedded in the chivalric tradition. Knights were expected to engage in jousting with not only physical strength but also moral fortitude. The rules of the joust require the knight to display respect for their opponent, ensuring that the contest remained honorable. A knight who deliberately injured their opponent outside the bounds of the rules would risk dishonoring themselves and their reputation. The event was about more than just winning. It was about upholding the ideals of fair competition and respect. The physical demands of jousting were immense, requiring a combination of strength, speed, and perfect timing. When two knights charged toward each other at full speed, their lances aimed at each other's chest or shield, it was an incredibly dangerous and high-stakes endeavor. The goal of the joust was to unseat the opponent by striking them with the lance or by shattering the lance on their shield. But the knight who was struck could easily fall and sustain serious injury. The sound of the clash of lances was deafening, and the impact could be bone-crushing. Knights wore armor to protect themselves, but even the most heavily plated suit couldn't completely shield them from the force of the impact. Despite the dangers, jousting was seen as a noble pursuit, an opportunity for knights to prove their valor and demonstrate their skill. When a knight succeeded in unseating their opponent, it was seen as a victory not just for their physical prowess, but for their courage, discipline, and adherence to the rules of the contests. Conversely, a knight who failed in the joust could be seen as lacking in skill or courage, a blow to their reputation that could have long-lasting consequences. Jousting was often a highly public affair, with large crowds gathering to watch the competition. Spectators could include nobles, royalty, and common folk alike, all eager to see the spectacle unfold. The joust was not just a contest of strength, but a social event, an opportunity for knights to demonstrate their prowess to a wide audience. And with so much at stake, the atmosphere was charged with excitement and tension. The public nature of jousting also made it a powerful tool for political maneuvering. Knights would often use tournaments as a way to gain favor with powerful figures, such as kings or lords. A successful performance in a joust could enhance a knight's social standing and bring them closer to influential patrons. On the other hand, a poor showing could tarnish a knight's reputation and make it harder for them to advance in the world of medieval politics. Jousting, as we know it, may have been a fixture of medieval tournaments, but it also had its moments of controversy. Critics of jousting often pointed to the violence and the risks involved in the sport, arguing that it was not a true test of chivalry, but rather a spectacle that prioritized entertainment over the ideals of knighthood. Some even questioned whether knights should be spending so much time engaging in public tournaments rather than focusing on the more serious business of warfare. But despite the critics, jousting remained one of the most beloved and enduring aspects of medieval tournaments. It provided a clear way for knights to demonstrate their skills and, in turn, earn the admiration of the public and the favor of their peers. And, in the end, the joust was far more than just a contest. It was a reflection of the values of the time, a microcosm of the medieval worldview that placed honor, strength, and bravery at the heart of knightly life. In many ways, jousting is the most enduring image we have of medieval tournaments. The loud clash of lances, the thundering hooves of the horses, and the spectacle of knights competing for glory and honor have remained firmly rooted in the public imagination. Today, jousting continues to be a popular event at medieval reenactments and Renaissance fairs, a living testament to the legacy of these historic tournaments. Historians still debate the role of jousting in the broader context of medieval society. Some view it as an important part of a knight's military training, while others see it more as a social event designed to entertain and display nobility. Regardless of its origins, jousting was undeniably an important and thrilling part of medieval tournament culture, and it remains one of the most iconic images from the Middle Ages. As we continue to delve deeper into the medieval tournament world, it's time to take a look at a less glamorous but equally significant aspect: the role of women in these events. While knights were the star of the show, jousting and sword fighting were not the only things happening behind the scenes at these grand spectacles. The women who attended tournaments, whether as spectators or active participants, played crucial roles that went far beyond the occasional cheer from the sidelines. In fact, tournaments in the Middle Ages often involved a great deal of pageantry and symbolism, with women playing central roles in many aspects of the events. You may be thinking, wasn't the tournament an event dominated by men? And yes, knights were at the forefront, but women, from noble ladies to queens, were crucial figures in the tournament drama, and their involvement went far beyond being passive observers. One of the most important roles women had in these events was that of the dame de tournoi, or lady of the tournament. These women were often the focus of the joust, with knights competing not only for glory, but for the favor of a lady. The act of dedicating a victory to a lady, or receiving her favor in the form of a token such as a scarf or ribbon, was an essential part of the tournament. The knights would perform their best, knowing that their honor and prowess would be judged by the lady's favor. In fact, tournaments were sometimes structured with specific women in mind. Ladies of noble houses or prominent figures who would be presented with the winner's token at the end of the day. The entire event was thus imbued with a layer of romantic chivalry. Imagine a knight charging down the lists, his eyes set on the opponent before him. But just as important was the vision of the lady watching from the sidelines. Her favor, whether it was a piece of cloth or a simple smile, was enough to drive a knight to the heights of bravery and skill. This ideal was enshrined in chivalric poetry and songs, and it formed one of the most symbolic elements of the tournament. But women's participation didn't stop at being the object of knights' affections. In fact, women often had an active role in organizing these tournaments, particularly in royal and noble circles. Queens and noblewomen were frequently involved in the logistical and ceremonial aspects of the tournament, from organizing events to serving as patrons. In many ways, they acted as protectors and sponsors, lending their support to ensure the success of the event. These women were often the ones to bestow prizes on the victors, cementing their roles as figures of authority and influence within the chivalric system. Historians still debate the extent of women's participation in these events. Some argue that their involvement was largely symbolic, with women serving primarily as objects of male competition and devotion. Others contend that their roles were more substantial, that they were integral to the tournament's organization and cultural significance. What's certain is that women played a significant role in shaping the rituals and pageantry of medieval tournaments, and their influence extended beyond mere spectatorship. Another important way women influenced tournaments was through their roles as patronesses. Noblewomen often sponsored tournaments, providing financial support, organizing the details, and offering prizes. In this sense, women were not just participants in the pageantry, they were active patrons of the event, helping to establish and maintain the social and political importance of the tournaments. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was known for her role in organizing and promoting tournaments. Her patronage of these events helped elevate their status, turning them into key social occasions for the elite of Europe. In addition to being the focus of knights' devotion, women also played a role in the rituals that surrounded the tournament itself. They would often present the tournament winners with the prizes, acting as the final judge of a knight's worth. This symbolism was not lost on the participants, who understood that winning a tournament was as much about securing favor from the ladies as it was about proving their martial prowess. In many ways, this aspect of the tournament reflected the broader social hierarchy, where the approval of a noble woman or queen was a critical factor in determining a knight's success. However, it's important to note that the role of women in tournaments was not without its limitations. Despite their influence, women were still confined to traditional gender roles, and their participation in the actual combat was non-existent. They could watch, sponsor, and provide tokens of favor, but they were not allowed to take part in the jousts or melees themselves. This division reflects the broader societal attitudes toward women during the medieval period, where they were often seen as being above the fray, as symbols of purity and virtue, rather than active participants in the violence and competition of the tournament. Historians still argue whether this idealization of women in tournaments was reflective of genuine respect, or whether it was more about maintaining societal norms and gender hierarchies. While women were certainly respected and revered in the tournament world, their roles were largely symbolic, and the events themselves were firmly rooted in a patriarchal structure. The knights fought for glory, and the women observed, providing moral and symbolic support from the sidelines. Despite this, their presence and influence remained an essential part of the tournament experience. As you reflect on the role of women in these medieval spectacles, it's fascinating to think about how their participation, while limited by the norms of the time, was still a vital part of the story. The knights' battles, while centered on martial skill, were also acts of devotion and honor to the women they sought to impress. And in return, these women helped shape the tournaments, not only by being the objects of knights' competition, but by being the patrons, organizers, and judges who ensured the tournament's success and continued cultural significance. The tournaments, as much as they were about combat, were also about courtship, honor, and social status, and women were crucial to all of these aspects. Their roles, while limited by the conventions of their time, were vital in maintaining the spectacle and meaning behind medieval tournaments. These women were part of the grand tradition of chivalry, helping to keep the ideals of the knightly code alive and making sure that tournaments were not just about the knights, but about the honor, devotion, and respect that they offered to the women they admired. With the knights battling in the lists and the women providing their influence from the sidelines, it's time to examine the deeper, sometimes darker side of the medieval tournaments, the real dangers and consequences. While tournaments were grand spectacles of skill and honor, they were also dangerous, often resulting in injuries and even death. For all the pageantry and the celebration of chivalry, these events were fraught with risk. Knights, after all, were still warriors, and a joust or melee wasn't simply a friendly contest. It was a fight for dominance, prestige, and survival. Jousting, in particular, was notoriously hazardous. Two heavily armored knights charging at each other at full speed, aiming their lances at each other's chest or shield, was a spectacle of physical strength and bravery, but it was also a recipe for disaster. The knights were often thrust into combat without the luxury of modern protective gear, relying on thick plate armor and padded layers to shield them from the devastating impacts. Even with this armor, A well-placed lance could knock a knight off his horse with incredible force, and the risk of injury was immense. If the lance didn't land squarely on the shield, it could pierce armor or even cause broken bones, internal injuries, or worse. The dangers didn't stop there. Jousting was a high-speed contest, with the knights charging toward each other with tremendous force. The horses themselves were a significant factor in the danger large. Powerful animals trained for battle could easily throw off a knight if they were startled or misdirected. And if a knight did fall from his horse, the chance of injury was dramatically increased, as the fall could lead to broken limbs, concussions, or even fatal injuries. As if the physical toll of jousting wasn't enough, there was also the psychological pressure. Knights weren't just competing for pride, they were competing for their honor, their reputation, and their place in society. The fear of failing in front of a large audience could be overwhelming. The loss of a joust could be seen as a disgrace, one that could diminish a knight's standing among his peers. And in an era where personal reputation was paramount, the consequences of failure could reach far beyond the tournament itself. Knights who lost repeatedly could find themselves marginalized, their worth questioned by both their peers and their patrons. Despite the brutal nature of the tournament, there were safeguards in place to prevent excessive harm. Most tournaments were governed by rules, with specific regulations about the types of lances to use, the angle of attack, and the amount of force permitted in a joust. The goal wasn't to kill or maim, at least, not directly, but to demonstrate skill, honor, and restraint. Still, these rules didn't always prevent serious accidents. The pressure to compete at such a high level often led to reckless behavior, as knights tried to outdo one another with increasingly dangerous tactics. As such, tournament organizers and heralds often had to step in to enforce the rules and maintain some semblance of order. Historians still debate the true frequency of injuries and fatalities in medieval tournaments. Some argue that the danger was greatly exaggerated, that tournaments were seen through a romantic lens of chivalric grandeur, and that, in reality, injuries were relatively rare. Others contend that the risks were far more severe, with many knights sustaining life-changing injuries during the course of their careers. We know that several famous knights and nobles died from injuries sustained in tournaments, while many others had to retire early due to the toll the events took on their bodies. It's likely that the truth lies somewhere in between. While tournaments were undoubtedly dangerous, the number of serious injuries and deaths may have been higher than we typically imagine. In addition to the physical dangers, tournaments also had social consequences. Knights who were seriously injured or killed in these contests risked losing the opportunity to fight in future tournaments. For a knight, being injured and unable to compete could result in a loss of social prestige, as tournaments were one of the primary ways for a knight to prove his worth and maintain his standing. A knight who was seriously wounded might find himself sidelined, unable to maintain his role as a warrior or protector of his lord. Yet, for all the risks, tournaments were an essential part of the knightly tradition. The honor, respect, and glory associated with competing and winning were too great to pass up. Even knights who had sustained injuries in past tournaments would return to the lists, driven by the desire for redemption and the need to uphold their reputation. This culture of honor and risk created a fierce and competitive environment where failure was rarely an option, and the threat of injury or death loomed large over the event. The darker side of the tournament was further exemplified in the melee, the more chaotic and free-form event that often accompanied jousting. In a melee, knights would engage in large-scale mock battles, where the goal was to unseat opponents and capture them, often leading to brutal brawls with no set rules. In these battles, knights were at the mercy of the chaotic nature of combat. With large groups of knights clashing, there was a much higher risk of serious injury or death. Swords, axes, and maces were wielded with force, and even the most skilled knights could be caught off guard in the fray. Interestingly, the melee had its own set of rituals and protocols that governed the behavior of the knights. But because of the nature of the event, it was often more difficult to enforce these rules. The melee was often seen as a test of a knight's endurance, bravery, and ability to perform under pressure. Unlike the joust, where knights faced off in a more controlled environment, the melee was a test of raw strength and resilience, one where knights would often risk everything for the thrill of the battle. In modern times, when we look back at the tournaments of medieval knights, it's easy to romanticize the idea of the brave and noble knight riding into battle with honor and skill. However, the reality was much more brutal, with high stakes, intense rivalries, and real dangers lurking behind every contest. For knights, tournaments were both a form of glory and a gamble with their lives, where success meant renown, but failure or injury could cost them everything. Historians still debate the true impact of these tournaments on the lives of knights and their societies. Some argue that tournaments were an important outlet for the aggression and rivalries of the knightly class, while others contend that they served as an opportunity for knights to demonstrate their value to potential patrons or lords. Regardless of the debate, one thing is clear: medieval tournaments, with all their risks and rewards, were far more than just games. They were a vital part of the knightly world, shaping both the individual and the society at large. Now that we've explored the darker side of tournaments, where danger and injury were never far behind, let's turn our attention to the grand pageantry and spectacle that made these events so irresistible to the crowds. The medieval tournament, while brutal in many ways, was also a glittering display of wealth, honor, and social status. Every element, from the knight's elaborate armor to the grand feasts and celebrations that followed, was carefully crafted to emphasize the importance and glory of these contests. Tournaments were more than just competitions. They were performances, showcasing the ideals of chivalry and the knightly way of life in all its grandeur. Imagine the scene. The tournament ground is surrounded by a large crowd. The nobility and royalty seated in their finest attire, their faces lit by the sunlight. The knights line up, their armor gleaming in the sun, the horses prancing with anticipation. The atmosphere is one of excitement and reverence, and the air is thick with the clatter of armor and the calls of heralds announcing the competitors. The whole event, while filled with the danger of combat, was also a celebration of culture, skill, and society. And in this display, everything from the knight's movements to the choreography of the events was designed to highlight not just the physical prowess of the participants, but the ideals of the age. The tournament wasn't just a battlefield, it was a performance in which the knights were the central actors. Their armor was more than just protection, it was a statement of their rank, status, and identity. Each knight's suit of armor was often adorned with intricate designs, family crests, and symbols that identified them and their lineage. The armor itself became an extension of the knight's reputation and honor, and it had to be meticulously crafted and polished for the event. In many ways, the armor was as important as the combat itself. It was a visual representation of the knight's standing in society, and the better the armor, the greater the perceived honor. In addition to the knights, the tournament was a spectacle for the masses, with a variety of social layers represented in the crowd. Nobles, commoners, and spectators from all walks of life would gather to witness the grandeur of the event. The tournament was often held as part of larger celebrations, including religious festivals or royal occasions, making it an even more extravagant event. The gathering itself was a symbol of the social hierarchy, with the nobility seated at the front, while the common folk watched from a distance. The idea was not just to entertain, but to remind everyone of their place in society, with knights as the heroic figures in shining armor and the audience as passive observers of their feats. The spectacle extended beyond the actual combat. After the jousts and melees were finished, the festivities would continue with feasts, dancing, and entertainment. A tournament was often a multi-day event, and during the breaks, knights would mingle with nobles, exchanging stories and perhaps even forging political alliances. The festive atmosphere was essential for reinforcing the social bonds that the tournament helped to create. The celebrations were full of music, food, and drink, with everyone from kings to commoners enjoying the spoils of the competition. Tournaments, after all, were not just about the knights. They were a chance for the entire community to come together and celebrate their shared culture. Historians still debate the true role of the tournament in medieval society. Some argue that tournaments were a way for knights to gain favor and establish their reputations, while others believe that the events had a much broader social function. The tournaments served as important moments of public display, where individuals could reaffirm their place in the social order. They were opportunities for the nobility to showcase their wealth and power, and for knights to prove their skill, bravery, and honor. The spectacle, with its grand displays of wealth, ritual, and ceremony, was an integral part of medieval social life. One of the most intriguing aspects of the tournament's pageantry was its symbolism. The events were a living embodiment of the ideals of chivalry, which emphasized honor, courage, and loyalty. The rituals surrounding the tournament, such as the knights, swearing oaths of allegiance, presenting prizes to the victors, and offering tokens of favor were all designed to reinforce these values. Each element of the tournament, from the weapons used in combat to the manner in which knights interacted with their opponents, was a reflection of the chivalric code that governed their behavior. And at the heart of the pageantry was the idea that the tournament was not just a physical contest, but a moral and spiritual test as well. For the knights, the tournament was an opportunity to display their mastery over both the physical and the ethical aspects of chivalry. To win a tournament was to prove that one had mastered the art of war and combat, but also that one upheld the values of the knightly class. It was a test of skill, but also of character. A knight who fought honorably, who respected the rules of the contest, and who demonstrated courage and integrity could earn the admiration and respect of their peers. On the other hand, a knight who cheated, displayed cowardice, or violated the codes of chivalry risked disgrace and humiliation. This balance between martial prowess and moral conduct was at the heart of the medieval tournament. At the same time, the tournament served as a way for the nobility to display their wealth and power. It was a highly expensive endeavor to organize a tournament, with the cost of the prizes, the venue, and the horses, armor, and other equipment necessary for the event. But for the wealthy, the tournament was a way to show off their status and reinforce their authority. It was a chance to demonstrate their generosity by offering lavish prizes and to assert their dominance over the lesser ranks of society. In this way, the tournament was a tool for maintaining the existing social order, reminding everyone of the hierarchy and reinforcing the power of the ruling class. Today, we may look back at medieval tournaments as a romanticized part of history, but in their time, they were very much a living, breathing expression of the ideals and social structures of the age. The tournaments were an essential part of medieval life, a place where knights and nobles could come together to prove their worth, display their power, and celebrate the values that defined their society. And while the dangers and the brutal competition were real, it was the pageantry, the ritual, and the symbolism that truly defined the tournament. It was an event that celebrated not just the physical prowess of the knights, but the ideals that held their society together. Now that we've explored the social spectacle and the pageantry of medieval tournaments, let's shift our focus to the more social and political side of these events. Tournaments were not just opportunities for knights to display their martial prowess, or for spectators to enjoy an exciting spectacle. They were also important political tools. These grand events were a platform where powerful figures could reinforce their political and social allegiances, forge alliances, and even settle rivalries. The influence of tournaments extended far beyond the lists, affecting the very structure of medieval politics and the relationships between kingdoms, lords, and knights. In the medieval world, power was often determined by alliances and loyalties, and tournaments played a significant role in establishing and strengthening these bonds. The knights who competed in these events were often bound to a specific lord or king, and their participation in tournaments was a way to publicly demonstrate their loyalty by aligning themselves with a powerful patron. Knights could enhance their social standing, secure land or wealth, and gain political influence. On the other hand, for a noble or king, hosting a tournament was an opportunity to display their own power and wealth, as well as to reaffirm their authority in the eyes of their vassals and allies. Tournaments also served as opportunities for kings and nobles to demonstrate their patronage and favor. A knight who performed well in a tournament could win valuable prizes, including land, money, or the favor of a high-ranking noblewoman. But these prizes were not just rewards, they were political tools. A knight who won a tournament might find themselves more closely aligned with a noble house that had sponsored the event, leading to increased favor and influence. Similarly, a knight who performed poorly or dishonorably might find themselves ostracized or even stripped of their social standing. In this way, tournaments were closely tied to the complex web of medieval patronage and political maneuvering. Some historians argue that tournaments were a way for knights to demonstrate their loyalty and competence to their lords, and thus to secure their place in the medieval political system. Others suggest that tournaments were simply an outlet for political and social competition, a way for nobles to show off their wealth and prestige while engaging in a controlled, socially acceptable form of violence. Regardless of the specific motivations, the fact remains that tournaments were deeply intertwined with the power dynamics of the time. The tournaments were much more than just a test of physical skill. They were about maintaining one's status, proving one's loyalty, and navigating the intricate relationships that governed medieval society. At the same time, tournaments were also used as tools for public displays of power and might. Kings, lords, and nobles would often sponsor large tournaments to demonstrate their wealth and authority. These events were not only occasions for knights to compete, they were grand spectacles that showcased the host's political clout. A well-organized tournament could attract the best knights, large crowds, and significant attention from both the public and other nobles. It was a way for the host to signal their strength and influence, positioning themselves as powerful figures in the medieval political landscape. In addition to their political role, tournaments also had an impact on the relationships between different noble houses. Rivalries between families were common in the medieval world, and tournaments often became a venue for these rivalries to play out. Knights would compete for the honor and glory of their houses, and the outcome of these tournaments could have lasting consequences for family honor. Families that lost repeatedly in tournaments might suffer a blow to their reputation, while those who triumphed could enjoy increased prestige and influence. Tournaments, in this sense, became a way for knights and nobles to stake their claim in the social and political order, and their outcomes could shape the course of medieval history. As tournaments grew in size and complexity, they began to take on even more political significance. For example, in some cases, tournaments were used to settle disputes between rival factions. Instead of engaging in open warfare, opposing lords or knights might agree to settle their differences in the lists. with the winner taking the prize or, in some cases, the political advantage. While this practice may seem odd to us today, it was not uncommon for disputes to be resolved in such a way, especially in an era where open warfare was costly and disruptive. By settling their conflicts in a controlled environment like a tournament, nobles could maintain their honor and reputation without the full-scale devastation of battle. The political importance of tournaments is also reflected in the way they were often used to solidify marriages and alliances. At a time when marriage was a strategic political tool, tournaments became opportunities for noble families to forge alliances through the marriages of their daughters to victorious knights or wealthy lords. A successful knight who won a tournament might find himself the subject of attention from noble families eager to form alliances. These strategic marriages helped strengthen the social and political bonds between noble houses and kingdoms, and tournaments played an important role in facilitating these arrangements. Historians still argue about the exact extent to which tournaments influenced medieval politics. Some suggest that tournaments were simply another form of entertainment for the nobility, a way to pass the time and enjoy some friendly competition. Others contend that tournaments were much more significant, playing a central role in the way medieval societies functioned. Whether they were used to settle disputes, solidify alliances, or simply display power, tournaments had a lasting impact on the political and social landscape of the Middle Ages. As we look back at the role of tournaments in medieval society, it's clear that these events were about much more than just knights and combat. They were about maintaining and securing power, forging alliances, and preserving social order. Tournaments served as a reflection of the complex political structures of the time, and their influence extended far beyond the lists and jousting fields. For knights, tournaments were a proving ground for their skills and honor. For nobles, they were a chance to display their wealth, power, and influence. And for the society at large, they were a reminder of the importance of loyalty, honor, and reputation in the medieval world. Now that we've seen the political and social significance of medieval tournaments, it's time to address another important aspect: the evolution of these events over time. What began as an intimate gathering of knights engaging in military practice gradually transformed into massive, organized spectacles that could draw large crowds from all corners of society. While early tournaments were held as a form of training or to settle disputes between individual knights, by the height of the Middle Ages, they had become grand public events with much more far-reaching consequences. But how did this evolution happen? One of the key factors in the transformation of medieval tournaments was the rise of chivalric culture and the growing importance of the noble class. As the influence of chivalric ideals became more ingrained in society, tournaments became a way for knights and noblemen to publicly display their martial skill, honor, and loyalty to their lords. This public spectacle was designed not only for the entertainment of the crowds, but also as a way to reinforce the social hierarchy. As tournaments became larger, the audience expanded to include not just fellow knights and nobles, but also commoners and even royalty. The participation of royalty, especially kings and queens, added a level of prestige to the event, further solidifying the tournament's importance as a political and cultural event. With this growing importance came more elaborate rules and regulations. Tournaments were no longer just about knights proving their skill on horseback or in hand-to-hand combat. They became carefully structured affairs with detailed protocols. This structure was essential to maintaining the ritualistic nature of the event and ensuring that it adhered to the codes of chivalry. The rules surrounding the joust, for instance, were codified and became more standardized, which not only made the event safer, but also ensured that knights had a fair chance to display their skill without the chaos of unregulated combat. The emergence of formalized tournaments with rules, etiquette, and a structured format was also a product of the increasing need for noble families to assert their prestige. As the medieval social order became more rigid, tournaments began to be used as public demonstrations of power and wealth. Wealthy nobles and kings would sponsor tournaments, providing lavish prizes and incentives for knights to compete. The prizes were not just about rewarding skill, they were also a way for the tournament sponsors to assert their authority and influence. A knight who won a prestigious tournament might be invited to a royal court or offered land, while a failure could result in disgrace. As we saw earlier, the tournament's shift from a combat practice into an organized, highly structured event also mirrored the increasing centralization of power in Europe. As kingdoms and empires grew larger, tournaments became more formalized and institutionalized, often aligning with the political goals of monarchs. Some kings would use tournaments to solidify their power by showcasing their control over the knightly class. The tournament allowed them to demonstrate their wealth, power, and cultural sophistication, sending a clear message to other rulers and to their own subjects. The growing popularity of tournaments also coincided with the rise of new forms of entertainment and culture in the Middle Ages. The rise of chivalric literature and the romanticization of knightly virtues played a huge role in transforming tournaments into elaborate performances of courtly love, honor, and nobility. Tournaments became not just about physical combat, but about the ideals and stories that they embodied. The knights were often portrayed as heroic figures, performing great feats of strength and skill in the name of love, honor, and virtue. These cultural narratives added a layer of meaning to the tournaments that transcended the actual competition itself. Historians still debate the extent to which these tournaments were truly symbolic, or whether they still held real military value. Some scholars argue that by the late Middle Ages, tournaments had become little more than a theatrical display with little connection to actual warfare, serving mostly as a means of showcasing status and power. Others contend that, despite their growing ritualization, tournaments continue to serve as a training ground for knights, providing them with important skills for real battlefield combat. But regardless of the military value, the spectacle of the tournament was undeniably important. As tournaments became more elaborately staged, they also grew in size and scope. They were no longer limited to small, localized events, but were now major affairs that could draw thousands of spectators. These large-scale tournaments, particularly those hosted by royalty, often took place in purpose-built arenas that could accommodate large crowds. The structure of the tournament grounds became an essential element of the event itself, further emphasizing the transformation from a martial practice to a grand performance. As these tournaments became larger, more and more resources were poured into organizing them. Specially trained horses, beautifully crafted armor, and extravagant costumes became integral parts of the tournament. The knights were expected to perform in the finest attire and with the most impressive gear to reflect their social status. Some knights even commissioned elaborate armor decorated with symbols of their house or family crest to add to the pageantry of the event. This increase in the scale and the spectacle of tournaments was part of the broader trend of medieval society's obsession with wealth, status, and public display. At the height of their popularity, tournaments could last for days, with various events taking place throughout the day. The most famous tournaments would feature multiple types of contests, jousting, swordplay, and even mock battles, allowing knights to compete in different ways, each designed to showcase different aspects of their martial prowess. Despite the growing spectacle and formalization of tournaments, there remained an element of risk. As tournaments grew larger and more competitive, knights pushed themselves to ever greater feats of bravery and skill, often at the cost of their health or safety. The pressure to win, to maintain one's reputation, and to impress the crowds and sponsors was immense. The popularity of these tournaments led to ever more daring and sometimes reckless performances, further adding to the spectacle's intensity. In the end, medieval tournaments were a fusion of entertainment, politics, and social order. They began as a way for knights to practice and demonstrate their martial skills, but eventually evolved into massive, highly organized events that mirrored the broader cultural shifts of the time. The grandeur and rituals of the tournaments were as much about social display and public pageantry as they were about combat. Tournaments became a stage where knights could demonstrate their courage and virtue, while also showing off their status and loyalty to their lords. And though they were dangerous, violent, and competitive, tournaments also served as a reflection of the ideals of chivalry, making them one of the most iconic symbols of the medieval world. As we continue to examine the evolution of medieval tournaments, let's explore the lavish festivities and revelry that took place after the competition itself. Tournaments, particularly those held by the royalty and nobility, weren't just about the combat. They were grand social events, and after the dust of the joust had settled and the last knight had ridden off the lists, the real celebration began. The knights, having proven their mettle, were often treated to feasts, dances, and performances that could last for days. These celebrations were an integral part of the tournament experience, providing a sense of community and a chance for the elite to relax and socialize after the intense competition. The feasts following tournaments were nothing short of extravagant. Imagine the scene: a long table laden with roasted meats, fine wines, and exotic fruits. The air is thick with the scent of roasting lamb and freshly baked bread, and the sounds of laughter and music fill the hall. The nobility and knights sit together, enjoying their hard-earned victory or commiserating over their loss as servants rush about to fulfill their every need. The feasts were often a display of wealth and abundance, with food and drink flowing freely, symbolizing the prosperity of the host. But the feast wasn't just a chance to eat and drink. It was an event in its own right, with much ritual and formality. The seating arrangements were often carefully planned, with knights and nobles placed according to their rank and social status. This was a time to cement political alliances, reinforce loyalties, and impress potential patrons. Guests would engage in lively conversation, boasting of their achievements in the tournament or sharing tales from their lands, while musicians played in the background and entertainers performed. These moments of relaxation were essential to the social fabric of medieval society. They allowed people to come together, share stories, and strengthen the bonds that held the complex web of medieval politics together. In addition to the feasts, tournaments were also accompanied by dances, joust-themed performances, and even masks, a kind of theatrical entertainment. The nights following the tournaments were filled with dancing and revelry. These were not casual gatherings, but highly structured events where the nobility would showcase their grace, refinement, and social prowess. The dances were often elaborate affairs, with intricate steps and performances that could last for hours. A knight's participation in the dance was as much a display of his manners and poise as it was of his ability to fight. The night might end with a formal ceremony, where the champion knight was awarded his prize or token of favor, often presented by a lady of the court. These moments were designed to reinforce the knight's victory and honor, elevating him in the eyes of the gathered nobility. The extravagance of the tournaments was designed to be not only a competition of physical strength, but also a display of cultural and social supremacy. The knights and nobles who attended these events were expected to demonstrate their wealth and refinement, using the occasion to highlight their status and influence. In this way, the tournaments acted as a microcosm of the medieval social structure, where the physical feats of the knights were balanced by the ceremonial and political aspects of the event. Knights who performed well on the field earned the right to bask in the glory of these celebrations, while those who failed were still expected to participate in the social rituals, often as a way to redeem themselves and restore their honor. Interestingly, the tournament's festivities were also a way for the medieval court to showcase its cultural and artistic achievements. Musicians, poets, dancers, and jesters were often part of the celebration, providing entertainment and enhancing the grandeur of the event. This was a time for nobles to flaunt their patronage of the arts, and the tournaments became a space where medieval culture was celebrated in its many forms. Poems and songs would be composed about the knight's victories, and minstrels would play in praise of their skill and bravery. This cultural display was just as important as the combat itself, reinforcing the idea that being a knight wasn't just about fighting, it was also about embodying the ideals of chivalry in every aspect of life. As the evening wore on, the celebrations would sometimes take on a more competitive nature. The knights and nobles would engage in friendly, yet fiercely competitive games, often involving feats of strength or dexterity. These games might include archery contests, wrestling matches, or even mock battles. The idea was to give the knights another opportunity to prove their worth, but this time in a more relaxed and social setting. These games were a continuation of the tournament's central theme: honor, skill, and bravery, but they allowed for a different kind of competition, one that was less about the stakes of public reputation and more about fun and camaraderie. Historians still argue about the importance of these post-tournament festivities. Some suggest that they were an essential part of the tournament's purpose, as they helped to reinforce social hierarchies and strengthen bonds between knights, lords, and patrons. Others contend that the revelry was simply a way for the nobility to relax and unwind, making it a necessary but less important aspect of the tournament experience. Regardless of the debate, it's clear that the festivities played a key role in the overall experience of the tournament, providing a chance for participants to celebrate their victories or redeem their failures in a more relaxed and social environment. In the end, these grand celebrations were more than just an extension of the tournament. They were a way of cementing the event's status as a significant social and cultural affair. Knights, lords, and ladies all had roles to play in the ritual, from the combat to the celebrations that followed. The tournament, as a whole, wasn't just about the knights proving their worth in battle. It was about demonstrating that they were part of a larger social order, one built on the ideals of honor, loyalty, and camaraderie. The festivities provided a space for knights to reinforce their status and for the nobility to show off their wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. These grand feasts, dances, and games may seem extravagant to us today, but they were an integral part of medieval life. For the knights, they were the reward for their hard-fought victories. For the nobility, they were a way to reinforce their status and influence. Together, they turned tournaments into more than just martial competitions. They became essential components of the social and political landscape of the time. As we've seen, medieval tournaments were not only a battleground for knights, but also a grand social event. However, even with all their pageantry, the underlying influence of religion in these tournaments was significant, guiding not only the moral compass of knights, but also the structure of the events themselves. Knights weren't just fighting for honor and glory, they were fighting with divine favor in mind. Religion and the church were deeply embedded in medieval life, and the tournament was no exception. Before the knights could engage in combat, many would participate in religious rituals, seeking blessings and protection. The church's involvement was paramount in ensuring that the tournament upheld the values of chivalry and religious figures often played an active role in the proceedings. Tournaments could be preceded by mass or prayers, as knights sought divine approval to fight honorably and fairly. The knight's understanding of divine intervention was deeply ingrained in their worldview. It was believed that success in the tournament was not only a matter of skill, but also of divine favors. By attending Mass or receiving a blessing, knights ensured that their victory or defeat was seen as part of a larger divine plan. The presence of clergy at these events signified that tournaments were not just secular competitions, they were, in a sense, sacred tests of a knight's character. The connection between tournaments and religion also extended to the symbolic gestures made during the events. Knights might take oaths before God, pledging to fight honorably and with respect for their opponents. These vows were taken seriously, as they invoked a sense of religious duty and the fear of divine punishment should they fail to uphold their promises. For the knights, the tournament was as much a spiritual endeavor as a martial one. They weren't just striving for physical victory, but seeking a deeper sense of righteousness that could only be validated through divine grace. Historians still argue whether the church's influence on tournaments was purely about moral conduct or whether it was part of a larger effort by religious leaders to maintain control over the knightly class. Some scholars suggest that the church saw tournaments as a way to instill Christian values in the knights, using them as a means to ensure that martial prowess was always tempered with honor and virtue. Others believe that the church's involvement was more strategic, an attempt to reinforce its own power by being involved in these prestigious events. Regardless of the church's true motivations, its influence on the tournament was profound, helping to shape how knights approached the competition and their behavior on the field. The religious aspects of the tournament also had a symbolic function. For example, during the event, knights would often present tokens to women, or they would compete in the name of a patron or deity. The religious symbolism in these actions was deeply embedded in the structure of the tournament, reflecting the medieval understanding that every knight's actions, even in competition, were part of a divine order. The idea that knights could win not just glory, but heavenly favor by adhering to the virtues of chivalry was fundamental to the religious integration of these events. However, while religion played a significant role in structuring the tournament and guiding knightly behavior, it also served as a political tool. Church leaders and monarchs saw tournaments as an opportunity to gain prestige and increase their influence. Kings and nobles would often call upon the church to provide blessings or even sponsor tournaments, ensuring that the event had a divine sanction. This connection between the church and tournament organizers meant that the church could help legitimize the social and political hierarchy, using these events as a way to remind the public of the divine order that governed society. Despite the religious undertones, not all knights viewed the church's involvement as a purely positive influence. Some knights, particularly those more aligned with the warrior code of honor, saw the church's involvement as an unnecessary imposition on their freedom to fight. For these knights, the religious rituals before the tournament might seem like little more than a formal exercise, a gesture that had little real effect on their actions during the tournament. However, for most knights, the church's blessing and the moral framework it provided were seen as essential for maintaining their personal honor and the legitimacy of their actions. As tournaments evolved, the church's role in these events began to wane. Over time, the focus shifted from religious significance to a more secular celebration of knightly skill and valor. However, the influence of the church remained a cornerstone of tournament culture for many years, and its religious rituals continued to shape the way knights participated. Even as the tournament became more of a public spectacle, it still retained that aura of spiritual significance, with knights seeking divine favor as they competed for glory. The religious connection between tournaments and chivalry extended beyond the event itself. The knights who participated in these competitions were often seen as agents of God's will, carrying the moral weight of their faith into the field of combat. Winning a tournament was not just about personal achievement, it was about proving one's worth as a warrior in the service of a higher cause. This sense of divine duty was deeply woven into the fabric of medieval chivalry, reinforcing the idea that knights were, in a sense, protectors, not just of their lords and ladies, but of the Christian faith. Today, when we think of medieval tournaments, we often imagine knights in shining armor, battling for honor and glory in front of cheering crowds. But the religious rituals that underpin these events remind us that, for many, tournaments were just as much about spiritual purification and divine favor as they were about physical competition. The church played an important role in shaping the way these events unfolded, guiding knights toward an ideal of chivalry that was not just about strength and skill, but also about virtue, honor, and a deep sense of divine duty. Historians still debate how much of the religious framework of the tournament was truly about spirituality and how much was about maintaining social order. Some suggest that religious influence was genuine, reflecting the knights' sincere belief in divine guidance, while others argue that the religious elements were more about maintaining control over the warrior class. Either way, the connection between religion and the tournament was undeniable and continued to influence the medieval knightly culture long after the last joust was fought. As we've examined the religious rituals that influenced the medieval tournaments, it's time to focus on how these events began to decline and evolve, eventually transforming from the grand spectacles of chivalric tradition into something altogether different. The evolution of tournaments into the later stages of the medieval period and into the Renaissance saw several factors come into play which contributed to their decline. It wasn't just a matter of changing tastes or technological advancements, but also shifts in political and military priorities. In the early stages of the tournaments, knights and nobility saw these events as necessary to display their skill, maintain their honor, and train for war. The joust was not just a display of strength, but a way to hone the skills needed for real battle. However, as the centuries wore on, warfare itself began to change dramatically. The rise of gunpowder and firearms in the 15th and 16th centuries altered the nature of combat forever. Knights, once seen as the ultimate warriors, found themselves less and less relevant in the face of new weapons and new military tactics. The armor they wore, designed to protect them from swords and lances, became increasingly obsolete against firearms and artillery. As firearms grew more advanced, knights began to lose their importance on the battlefield. The once feared knight in shining armor, who had been the epitome of martial prowess, was now facing competition from gunmen and cannons. In this rapidly changing landscape, the tournaments, which were designed to showcase knightly skill and honors, started to feel outdated. Tournaments had been an essential part of knightly culture, but as the role of the knight diminished in real combat, the tournaments began to lose their relevance. Historians still argue whether the changing nature of warfare was the sole reason for the decline of tournaments. Some believe that the rise of the standing army and the use of firearms made tournaments obsolete, while others suggest that tournaments lost their appeal because they became overly formalized, disconnected from the realities of war. The increase in the number of rules, rituals, and ceremonial aspects of the tournaments may have made them less exciting and more about performance than actual combat, as knights no longer saw the need to hone their combat skills for war. Tournaments became less about preparation for battle and more about sport, and even sport began to lose its luster as the novelty wore off. By the end of the 16th century, tournaments began to shift from brutal displays of martial prowess to more ceremonial and symbolic events. The joust was no longer a dangerous contest between life and death, but a stylized show of chivalric values. The knights no longer competed to prepare for war, but to showcase their loyalty, honor, and courage in a controlled environment. This shift marked a significant change in the nature of tournaments. Rather than a test of warrior skill, they became a display of nobility and an opportunity for the elite to gather in one place and celebrate their social status. In addition to these internal changes, external factors were also at play in the decline of tournaments. The rise of modern sports, such as fencing and hunting, began to take the place of the medieval tournament as outlets for martial skills. These new activities, more refined and less dangerous than the old jousts and melees, began to gain popularity among the aristocracy. With the increasing sophistication of royal courts, tournaments began to lose their initial thrill and purpose, and their place was slowly taken by other forms of entertainment. Furthermore, the political environment of Europe was undergoing a transformation, with the growth of centralized monarchies and the consolidation of power in the hands of kings and queens. The feudal system that had supported the rise of tournaments began to erode, as power shifted away from the nobility to centralized governments. The tournaments, which had been an essential tool for nobles to assert their power and influence, lost their political significance. Kings no longer needed to prove their dominance through tournaments. Instead, they could rely on the power of their standing armies and their control over the people. Despite the decline in their martial relevance, tournaments continue to be celebrated throughout Europe in the 17th century, but in a much more controlled, symbolic form. The tournament's original purpose, to prepare knights for combat, was replaced by the goal of providing entertainment and reinforcing the social order. The knights, still dressed in elaborate armor and wielding their lances, continued to perform for the audience, but the focus was no longer on martial skill. It was about spectacle, tradition, and the continued legacy of chivalry. Tournaments, which had once been a reflection of the realities of medieval warfare, had now become a form of theater rather than a genuine test of combat prowess. They had evolved into performances where knights could show off their prowess, but without the dangerous consequences. As they became more theatrical, they started to resemble the kinds of sporting events we might recognize today, like modern-day rodeos or equestrian shows, which showcase skill but with much less risk. The sport still held onto the symbolic aspects of chivalric ideals, but it was no longer a reflection of the brutal nature of war. The final nail in the coffin for the medieval tournament came with the gradual disappearance of knights as a distinct social and military class. As armies became more professional and the role of knights was relegated to ceremonial functions, tournaments became less about showcasing warrior culture and more about perpetuating a nostalgia for the past. The knight's role in society became largely symbolic, and by the 18th century, tournaments were no longer held in the same form as they had been in the past. Their place in society had shifted from a military necessity to a cultural relic. Today, we look back on medieval tournaments as a fascinating chapter in history, but one that has long since passed. While they may have once been an essential part of medieval life, they are now more a symbol of a bygone era. The tournaments of the past have evolved into the pageants and competitions we see today, where the focus is more on tradition than on preparing for battle. Yet, the legacy of the medieval tournament continues in modern sporting events, where ideals of honor, bravery, and competition still persist, albeit in a much more controlled and safer environment. Historians still debate the lasting impact of medieval tournaments on modern culture. Some argue that they helped establish the foundation for modern competitive sports, while others suggest that they were merely a temporary distraction from the real business of medieval life. Regardless of where you stand, the history of tournaments is a reminder of the complex relationship between combat, culture, and society, and how, over time, the meaning of these events shifted to reflect the changing values and priorities of each era. Having explored the decline and transformation of medieval tournaments, let's now examine the lasting legacy these events left behind. While the tournaments themselves may have disappeared as major social and political events, their influence on the development of modern sports and our cultural understanding of competition is undeniable. The transition from dangerous, life-threatening combat to more ceremonial competitions marked a shift in how society viewed physical contests and honor. The ideals of chivalry. The structure of the events and the competition itself all laid the groundwork for many of the sporting events we recognize today. At the heart of medieval tournaments was a desire to display skill, strength, and honor, a desire that is still evident in many modern sports. Jousting, the centerpiece of these tournaments, directly influenced the development of modern equestrian sports. The principles of mounted combat, control over the horse, and the precision of the lance all found their place in today's competitive riding disciplines. The basic concept of one-on-one combat in a controlled, structured environment, complete with rules, honor, and ceremonial elements, is mirrored in many modern-day events. Think of the fencing matches of the Olympics, where competitors must uphold specific codes of conduct while dueling for victory. Perhaps even more significantly, medieval tournaments provided the foundation for the structure of modern team-based and individual sports. The highly ritualized nature of the tournaments, where knights competed in a series of events with specific rules, can be seen as a precursor to modern-day competitions like tennis, boxing, and even soccer. The importance of team dynamics, individual effort, and the preservation of honor during these medieval contests can still be seen today in how sports are structured to emphasize both personal achievement and team success. While many modern sports focus on the athleticism of the participants, tournaments in the medieval world were deeply intertwined with the nobility, politics, and social hierarchy. As much as knights fought for personal glory, they also fought to demonstrate their loyalty and power. In the same vein, many of today's top-level sports events are tied to political, economic, and social power. Major sporting events like the FIFA World Cup or the Olympic Games are about far more than just athleticism. They are global events that showcase national pride, cultural identity, and political influence. Much like medieval tournaments, these events have become opportunities for countries and individuals to assert their dominance and highlight their cultural significance. While medieval tournaments served a functional role in training knights and displaying their martial prowess, they also provided a spectacle that was essential to medieval society. In a world where entertainment options were limited, these events were a major source of cultural expression. The knights, the pageantry, and the lavish celebrations that followed were an essential part of medieval life, serving as moments of public celebration and collective identity. Modern sports, in many ways, have replaced this need for large-scale public displays of martial prowess, but the spectacle of the event and the sense of community it fosters remains unchanged. The rituals, pageantry, and camaraderie of medieval tournaments also offer an important cultural window into the lives of those who participated in these events. They weren't just competitions of strength, they were complex social occasions where knights, lords, and ladies came together, displaying their values, allegiances, and honor. Even as tournaments have evolved into modern sports, the roots of these events remind us of the importance of tradition, the pursuit of excellence, and the importance of community in sport. In many ways, tournaments were a reflection of the medieval worldview, where physical contests were more than just a test of skill. They were a demonstration of character, loyalty, and social standing. Today, sports competitions, especially those at the highest levels, continue to be places where athletes perform for both personal achievement and the honor of their country, team, or community. The legacy of tournaments, in this sense, is alive and well in our modern sports culture. Additionally, tournaments help to foster the development of competitive spirit and sportsmanship, values that continue to thrive in modern sports. A knight's performance in the tournament was a public matter. Victory brought honor and glory, while defeat was a blow to reputation. In much the same way, athletes today compete not only for trophies, but also for the respect of their peers, fans, and nation. While the medieval knight competed for the favor of a lady or to earn a noble title, modern athletes compete for accolades, sponsorships, and worldwide recognition. Yet the core of competition remains deeply rooted in the pursuit of excellence. And let's not forget the role of the spectator in both medieval tournaments and modern sports. Just as medieval tournaments were often open to the public, drawing large crowds to witness the knight's feats of strength and bravery, today's sporting events are mass spectacles that bring people together to celebrate competition. The sense of camaraderie and community that was fostered in the tournament arena continues to be a key aspect of modern sports. Whether it's the adrenaline rush of a football game, the strategic complexity of a tennis match, or the global unification seen in the Olympics, these shared experiences, where people from all walks of life come together to cheer on athletes, are a direct echo of the medieval tournament atmosphere. Historians still debate the degree to which medieval tournaments truly impacted the evolution of modern sports. Some argue that their primary role was as a form of entertainment for the elite, while others suggest that their military and cultural implications had a deeper influence on the development of competition and public spectacle. Regardless of where you stand on the issue, it's clear that tournaments played a key role in shaping not only the knightly culture of their time, but also the broader social and cultural practices that continue to influence how we approach sport today. While medieval tournaments have faded into history, their influence endures. In every modern sporting event, there are echoes of the knights in shining armor, charging down the lists, fighting not only for victory, but for honor, reputation, and glory. The pageantry, the rituals, the importance of loyalty and chivalry, all of these elements are still alive in the world of sports. So, the next time you watch a competitive event, whether it's the World Cup, the Olympics, or a local tournament, remember that you're witnessing the modern continuation of a tradition that had been evolving for centuries. As we near the conclusion of our journey through the fascinating world of medieval tournaments, let's take a step back and reflect on their lasting legacy and how they have influenced our modern-day understanding of competition, chivalry, and sporting events. While medieval tournaments may seem like a relic of the past, the traditions, values, and structure of these events have found their way into our contemporary sports and culture. The essence of the tournament, the celebration of skill, honor, and community continues to shape the way we view modern sports. Tournaments, as we've seen, were much more than mere competitions. They were cultural events, deeply embedded in the social fabric of the medieval world. For knights, tournaments were about proving their worth, not just through physical skill, but also through adherence to the ideals of chivalry, loyalty, bravery, and respect. The medieval knight was expected to embody these virtues both on and off the field, and tournaments were an arena where these values could be publicly displayed. Today, while the focus has shifted away from the medieval concept of knighthood, the principles of competition, honor, and glory that were so integral to tournaments still thrive. Modern sports, from football to athletics to martial arts, retain the spirit of the medieval tournament, albeit with fewer lances and less armor. Athletes today compete not only for the thrill of victory, but also for a sense of personal achievement, national pride, and public recognition, similar to the knights who fought for their families, their lords, and their own honor. In a way, the modern Olympics embody the same ideals that medieval tournaments sought to celebrate. Just as knights once competed for the favor of noble ladies, the approval of their peers, and the glory of their homeland, athletes in today's global competitions vie for similar recognition. The Olympic Games, with their opening ceremonies, medals, and national pride, resemble the grand spectacle of medieval tournaments, with the added layer of global unity. The competitive spirit, combined with the celebration of human achievement, remains unchanged. This is a testament to how tournaments, even though they've evolved, continue to shape our cultural understanding of competition. Additionally, much like tournaments, modern sports often serve as a platform for political and social statements. In medieval times, tournaments could be used to settle disputes, display power, and reinforce political allegiances. Today, athletes use their platforms in similar ways, whether it's protesting injustice, advocating for social change, or representing their countries on the global stage. Just as tournaments were embedded in the political and social structures of medieval society, modern sports are deeply intertwined with the values and issues of our time. Whether it's the use of the tournament to showcase nobility, politics, or individual valor, modern athletes continue to embody these traditions in their own way. In the medieval world, tournaments were a tool for social cohesion. They brought together people from all walks of life, knights, nobles, commoners, to witness displays of skill and honor. The sense of community at these events was palpable, as everyone gathered to watch the knights compete, cheer on their champions, and share in the excitement. Today, modern sports serve a similar purpose, bringing together people from all over the world to cheer for their teams, celebrate victory, and share in the communal joy of competition. Sports have become a global language, uniting people across borders, languages, and cultures, just as tournaments once did in the medieval world. But perhaps the most significant way in which medieval tournaments continue to influence modern society is through the enduring ideal of chivalry. While the knightly code of the Middle Ages has largely faded, its core principles still resonate today. Chivalry, with its emphasis on honor, integrity, and respect, is something that continues to influence how we view athletes and competition. Athletes are often lauded for their sportsmanship, their ability to uphold the values of respect, fairness, and honor, just as medieval knights were celebrated for doing the same. The idea that victory should be earned through skill and honor rather than through dishonorable means is a value that still holds strong in modern sports. In conclusion, while the medieval tournaments may no longer be the center of social and political life, their legacy continues to shape the world of modern sports and competition. The tournaments were more than just martial contests. They were events that embodied the ideals of chivalry, honor, and loyalty. They were performances, celebrations, and spectacles that brought people together, reinforcing the social order and providing knights with the opportunity to demonstrate their skill and honor. Today, those same principles of competition, spectacle, and honor continue to thrive in the world of sports. The medieval tournament may have faded into history, but its influence can still be felt in the events we celebrate today. So, the next time you watch a sporting event or participate in a competition, take a moment to reflect on the rich history that has led us to this point. The knights of the medieval tournaments, with their swords and lances, have given way to modern athletes with their basketballs and tennis rackets, but the spirit of competition, honor, and community they embodied remains timeless. Whether in a medieval tournament or on the modern playing field, the pursuit of excellence and the celebration of human achievement continue to unite us all.